My name is Shamila Chaudhary. I work here at Johns Hopkins SAIS as Senior Advisor to Dean Vali Nasser. I'm also a fellow at the school's Foreign Policy Institute, where I direct a forum called The Big Picture. And some of you may have gone to these events in the past year. It's a forum that explores international affairs through arts and culture. And since we started last year, we've been hosting photojournalists, musicians, filmmakers, storytellers, and all kinds of non-policy experts to help us dig deeper into how kind of policy shapes and influences the world from different perspectives. So today's event is in that vein, and I'm very happy to have the Big Picture and the Middle East Studies program hosting this very special film screening today and conversation in partnership with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and filmmaker and activist Mazair Bahari. Thank you for joining us all the way from the UK. So this is a truly kind of big deal. This is the first screening of the film as well. So we're very honored that they chose SAIS to have this. The film is called 82 Names, Syria, Please Don't Forget Us. It is the story of Mansour Omari, a Syrian human rights activist who was imprisoned and tortured by the Assad regime. And while in prison, Mansour and his cellmates wrote their names in blood and rust on scraps of cloth that eventually were smuggled outside of Syria. So this is a story of that. And these pieces are now on display at the Holocaust Museum in DC. And is the exhibit open? It is just closed. Okay, so they have been on display. And so when we initially agreed to host the film, I thought we were just showing a film about Syria. And the film is about Syria, but it's also about so much more. And after you see it, you'll know what I mean. It's about 1940s Auschwitz and about the Japanese Americans during World War II in internment camps. And it's also about Charlottesville, Virginia, just this past year in July. You'll see what I mean. So the film obviously is about conflict and difficult issues, but it's also a film about resolution. And it opens up a very interesting conversation about how memorials and memorializing conflict can help us confront violent histories and our histories of conflict, to develop a narrative to actually talk about them. And it's not meant to give you a certain view. It's just meant to show you that we need to talk about these things. And I don't know how many of you have read the interview that we posted online at Big Picture SAIS, but I interviewed Mazair, and he went into some of these themes in the interview, and we'll get into the meat of those topics today. And I'm so glad that he's joining us today for this discussion. He's a renowned journalist and activist, and he himself, like the subject of the film today, was a political prisoner in Iran in 2009. So I think that's another interesting dynamic that we can explore. How is it for him to actually make a film like this, given his experience? So we'll show the film, and after that, we'll have a discussion about these issues, and we'll open it up for Q&A with all of you. So SAIS students, ask your good questions like you always do. And so before we go to the film, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Todd Stanky, who's the Director of International Education Outreach from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He'll say a few words, and then the film will begin immediately after that, and we'll have our conversation. So thank you, everyone, and please join me in welcoming Todd.
Thank you. Thank you, and hello, everyone, and thanks to the Big Picture and SAIS for having us. I just say a very few words, and I'll start with the words of our founding chairman, Elie Wiesel, who said that remembering was an act of generosity towards the future. And built into the Holocaust Museum from the very beginning was the idea that we remember what happened, and we try to learn from what happened in order to create a better future. And of course, Syria is probably number one of a distressingly high number of scenarios where the future is not looking so bright. So it was very inspiring one day to learn that Mansour Omari came to our museum with these pieces of cloth that was mentioned that we had shown, and you'll hear the story in the film. And the fact that he brought it to us was very intriguing to me, because it brings together two parts of what the museum does that not very often do they sit together. One is what all the work the museum has done on crimes against humanity in Syria today, and the other is our effort to demonstrate the global relevance of Holocaust history. And this was just a great story, and when I heard that he came, by reading the Washington Post, which tells you about internal communication at the museum, I was with Mazair. We were in Chicago together. Mazair was speaking at a museum event, and it seemed like this was a story that needed to be told. We were going to have the exhibit, but it was only going to be up there for a few months, but this story had to be told. And Mazair and Mansour created something amazing out of it. So thank you again for being here. And although you cannot come to the museum and see an exhibit about Mansour, you can come and see our new exhibit on Americans and the Holocaust. It's a new special exhibition, which is really a great thing about what Americans knew and how much they knew and what they did and what they didn't do, both in the government and civil society. So it has a lot of also resonance for what's going on today. So enjoy the film. I think we're going to go right to that, and thanks again.
Film or the cookies?
No, it's the film, and let me commend you again in the museum for initiating this tremendous and very valuable body of work, and hopefully it will lead to many other important conversations related to this topic. So on the walls over here to my left, you'll see some images of, this is Syria as well, and this is pre-war Aleppo. We had an event here earlier this year, and a lot of the photographs are gone, but we've kept these, and the square, the Aleppo square that you see in the center is virtually destroyed. All of that is gone now. But as I was watching the film, it struck me that the exhibit we had in the related conversation was itself a kind of memorialization of kind of this city that people once knew and that was physically destroyed. And it was an effort to kind of put those memories and physical pieces and ephemera back together to have a conversation about justice and moving forward.
And actually, these photos remind me of my trip to Aleppo in 2008, I believe. Yeah, 2008. I did a series about Iran called The Taste of Iran, and it was discovering Iran through its cuisine. So we went from the north of Iran to the south of Iran and talked about Iran in the context of the cuisine. And someone at the Syrian Ministry of Culture or Tourism saw the series on the BBC, and they called me and said, we want to do a taste of Syria. So I went there, and actually I was in Aleppo for a couple of days, and I just remembered the amazing city. That series was not made because of different reasons, but whenever I see the destruction of Aleppo, the ones that shots that we show in the film, it just breaks my heart to see such beautiful cities. All those restaurants that you see, you know,
Yeah. Well, and the conversation we had was talking about the vendor that sells roast chicken, and he's no longer there, and they don't know if he's died or not. And we use these images as a vehicle to talk about all the work that needed to be done should the war end, right? And the mechanics of peace and conflict resolution and reconstruction are so detailed, and they involve so many different communities that it was an overwhelming conversation. But I thought that we might get into that a little bit with you, because the film touches on those things. But first, I want to make a point that I realized when watching this. When the Holocaust happened, no one knew it was happening until kind of some time had passed. We didn't live in this modern era of information and, information sharing and social media that we live in now. And so it was something that was known only to its victims and the perpetrators until a certain period of time had passed. But in the case of Syria, it's the complete opposite. We've known what's been happening there. We have more images than we'll ever need to kind of prove that this conflict is severe and needs to be addressed and memorialized. And we saw that it was very jarring to see Assad being so callous and cavalier about kind of the photographs and asking for, further proof. But even he had it in front of him. And so my question for you is, given this kind of world that we live in where there is proof, but there's also fake news, how do we begin this process of memorializing a conflict that hasn't really ended?
I think it's impossible to memorialize it now, and it might be even more difficult now that we have this deluge of information coming out of Syria, and we are flooded by images of dead people and destroyed buildings and destroyed bodies. And it's very difficult to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. Some of the scenes that we see on television, that comes out of Syria, it's just unbelievable. And at the same time, we have people on the other side who are providing information as well. So it's very difficult, I think, to make sense of what is happening in Syria, what has been happening in Syria for the past 7, 8 years now. Eventually, people take a distance, like what happened with the Holocaust, like what happened with the massacre, and the genocide in Cambodia, genocide in Rwanda, that it took the Rwandans about 7 years to start building the Museum of Genocide in Kigali. And for Syrians, it's important, to take a distance. But what Mansour has done is very heroic in terms of collecting these names and artifacts, because as the museum's representative says in the film, it's very important to have these artifacts in order to be able to show them in the future and have it in that memorial that is going to eventually be built. So it's very difficult. I mean, when I look at that picture now, it's very difficult for myself, and I've seen so many pictures of destroyed Aleppo now, but it still is very difficult for me to believe, and I'm not from there. Mm. I don't have that kind of emotional bond that someone from Syria or someone from Aleppo can have with her or his city. Mm. Yeah. So and the other thing is that, as you see in the film, even Holocaust victims, they could not believe their eyes. How can you believe that our people are being gassed and bodies are being burnt? It's just unbelievable. And on the other hand, you have these shameless demagogues like Assad, who's just lying through his teeth. And he has many supporters, including people in the Iranian government, including people in Russian government, and among some people in the left in different countries, in this country, mm-hmm. in the UK, who are supporting the Assad regime because of their hatred of the American imperialism. Mm.
On Assad in particular, it strikes me that any process of reconciliation has to be both bottom up and top down. So the bottom up is what we've been seeing in the film and examples of other kind of communities mobilizing to make sure memory is preserved and that justice is served. But then the top-down part has to be kind of complementary to that. And I think a good example was Chancellor Merkel, who was basically talking to her people and saying, we're a strong country, we can deal with this is something that we can do. But Assad isn't saying that, right? And it's probably not going to be Assad, we know that, but there needs to be a top-down approach within the Syrian context as well. And I guess in the course of your research, I'd be interested in knowing kind of what your thoughts are on that. In the absence of having that, how does something like this get addressed?
Yeah, I mean, that is something that Mazen Darwish talks about at the end of the film, towards the end of the film, that in order to find justice in Syria, you need to have peace, you need dialogue, and you need some sort of understanding between different people. Something that happened in South Africa, for example, that there was a truth and reconciliation process. People who were victimizers, they got together with victims and talked about it. But still, South Africa, I was there last year, and it's, you can still see the scars of decades of apartheid in South Africa. So, of course, for a real reconciliation to happen in Syria, some people from the Ba'ath Party, some people from who were parts of the Assad regime have to talk to the opposition, have to confront the past, have to apologize for the past in order to have a reconciliation. But at this point, it's very raw. The emotions are so raw that it's impossible. For example, someone like Mazen Darwish, what he says is not accepted by most Syrians now because their emotions is so raw that, you know, someone whose brother is killed, someone whose family has been killed by the Assad regime, or on the other side by ISIS or other groups, the emotions are so raw that it's very difficult. So you just need time to heal. But at the same time, you know, we're going through this process and it's a very helpless situation. So my research is just Yes, it just made me really depressed at times. And I think when you see Mansour's uncomfortable silences in the film, they are very telling. It's a desperate situation. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know what to do.
The parallels drawn with the Holocaust, I think, are very striking, but they're also very daring, given kind of the communities that you're trying to reach with this film in the Muslim world. And you talked about this in the film a bit, but give us a little bit more context about kind of, you know, what's the mindset when, you know, when you're in the Middle East and you're talking about the Holocaust and you're comparing this conflict to that? Like, what's the mindset of the people that are receiving this?
It's very different in different countries in the Middle East. And I can say that, actually we were just talking about it, in Iran there is less, I have come across anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish feelings and even anti-Israeli feelings than in the Arab world. Because for one, Iranians don't have that much affinity with Palestinians. Yes, there are some people in the Iranian government, the Revolutionary Guards, hardcore supporters of the Iranian government who really sympathize with the Palestinians, but the majority of Iranians don't have that much affinity. And also because of the constant propaganda by the Iranian government against Israel, the majority of people who don't like the Iranian government, they're sympathetic towards Israel and Jews in general. But in the Arab world, it is very difficult to talk about the Holocaust and to talk about Jews in general. And I remember we were trying to, this film came about after we wanted to make another film with the Holocaust Museum to bring some people from the Middle East to look at the exhibitions at the Holocaust Museum, and we wanted them to be from different countries, from some Arab countries, some people from Iran, from Afghanistan, and to have a dialogue and meet the Holocaust survivors and to have a conversation about that. And it was very easy to find the Iranians. We could find 50 Iranians from this area, Washington area, easily. But we couldn't find any Arabs to come. And even though there were some people who were really sympathetic to the Holocaust and to the Jews off camera, they did not want their faces to be shown because they were worried about people back home. They did not want their families to be disturbed, and also they didn't want to be ostracized by their own communities. So it is a very difficult subject to talk about. But we thought if we can make the issue of the Holocaust more relevant to the audiences in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, then they can have a better understanding of the Holocaust, and that and humanize the victims of the Holocaust as well, and have one person from the Arab world meeting Holocaust survivors and going to different places where Holocaust happened. That was a way to start this process. But of course, this is one film, and I think it's just one step. You need different people to do this, different people to talk about it. And you need also, as we said, but others to have a better understanding, to talk to each other. You need Jews and Arabs, they talk about the Holocaust and they talk about their issues in order to find solutions.
The one thing I learned from watching this film was that, one thing you're trying to do is facilitate a narrative between Holocaust deniers and educating, and those who educate about the Holocaust. But in doing so, it's become very clear that within the various Arab communities that they themselves don't have their own narrative to talk about the conflicts that they've dealt with, right? The internal conflict. And so because it's so politicized talking about the Holocaust itself. And so with Mansour, who's not even able to find words to express what has happened to him, that's understandable, I think.
Sure.
But over time, one would hope that films like this would kind of lead to developing that larger narrative.
Yes, and also Mansour is writing a book, and he's after this experience has become a part of the book as well, because he started writing his book 2 years ago, and this experience was not part of it. Now he's made this experience as part of the book as well. I think the main thing for me was that if you confront the past, if you can understand your past, as Germans have done, as some people in this country have done, some people in different countries in Europe have done, then you just become stronger. And that's what Klaus, again, the European representative of the Holocaust Museum, said, that Germany is a stronger country. And when Chancellor Merkel says that we're a stronger country, why? Because they've confronted the past. They have somehow exercised that's their demons, and they're trying to get rid of it. Of course, there are still neo-Nazis in Germany, but they are in a minority. And no one can even think that neo-Nazis or far-right groups come to power. But when a country cannot or does not want to confront its past, like in Turkey, or like what is happening in Hungary, that they're trying to deny what happened in the past, or like in Poland, that they're trying to erase any kind of involvement in the Holocaust, then there is that danger that they don't become stronger, and also there is a chance that far-right groups can come to power. And I think for the Middle Easterns, the first thing to do is to confront the past. For the Iranians, to confront what happened 40 years ago during the revolution, 35 years ago during the massacre of prisoners in Iran. And also for the Syrians to confront what happened now.
You talked about Mansour and what he's working on now. Can you talk a little bit more about how it was for him kind of dealing with these issues in the film, and going to Germany and visiting these places, given that he grew up in a culture where there was a lot of denial of the Holocaust. Yeah. And also we were hoping he would be here with us today. He wasn't able to make it. If you could give us an update on how he's doing.
apparently he had some problems with his foot or leg. I'm not sure. Is it foot or leg? Leg, yeah. So because of the tortures that he had in prison, he has to have some surgeries, and he cannot travel because of that. And he's sorry for not being able to be here. I think what happened to him during the trip, it was shown in the film that he was very open. He was, and in a similar way that I was talking about Iranians being sympathetic to Jews and Israel and be open to learn more about the Holocaust. According to Mansour, many Syrians are like that as well because of the constant propaganda of the Assad regimes, the father and the son against Israel. People are becoming more curious about Israel, and they're trying to learn more about Israel and Jews and the Holocaust. So Mansour was very open to learn more. And also, he's a very courageous person. He was courageous to write those names and bring out the names, and he's also very courageous in terms of his willingness to understand the other side and other people. But I think it was more overwhelming for him. He didn't think that he would be as emotional, especially when we visited Sachsenhausen camp outside of Berlin. It was really emotional for him, and it brought some memories, and we didn't include some shots in the film that he pushes the camera aside and all that. And I was, I mean, I should have understood him better in that situation, but as a filmmaker, I just wanted to film him and wanted to ask him more information, but he just pushed the camera aside and didn't want to talk about it. So it was really emotional for him. And also, I think that is that's the issue that many people, we were talking about it the other day in the interview, that many people who deny the Holocaust, many people who hate Jews, Muslims, or others, it's just because of ignorance. Many people who were demonstrating in Charlottesville, like, I don't know, 50, 70 miles from here, when they said that Jews will not replace us, I don't think they've ever met a Jewish person in their lives. I don't think that they know anything about Jews. And if they meet a Jewish person, if they are exposed to information about the Holocaust, if they ever visit the Holocaust Museum, I'm sure they will change. I'm sure they will not be thinking the same.
So you yourself were a political prisoner in Iran, and so I think in some ways you have a lot in common, you know, with the film, the topic of the film. What goes through your mind? I mean, Mansour talked about kind of, or no, it was his friend, the woman, she talked about kind of what she was thinking when they came to their offices.
Sure.
What goes through your mind? You know, and you don't have to talk too much about yourself because I know we're here to talk about the film, but surely there's a certain kind of thought process that goes through your mind initially, and then, you know, when you're there, something, you know, your thinking probably evolves, and what happens to you?
Well, as the woman in the film says, you think about practicalities first. So when they put you in a solitary confinement, you don't think about these, you know, philosophical issues that, you know, how am I going to live, you know, isolated from people, from my loved one. Your immediate thought is that I need to go to the toilet. There is no toilet in this room. What am I going to do? How can I, you know, how much longer I can tolerate this? Or when they give you food, you're thinking about the quality of food. Or when you see that there's only one blanket in the room, you're just thinking that, okay, I'm used to have a pillow, a mattress, and a blanket. How am I going to sleep? So those are the first ideas that come to your mind. And I think Mansour's memory of prison was like that as well, that, you know, they had to find a way to live together, 80 people in a very small cell. How do they have to live together? And then, of course, when you come out of prison and people ask you questions, you can come up with more philosophical, romantic
There's more time to
ideas
think
of
about
prison.
it.
Yes.
What would you tell the students in the room about kind of what they can do to help so that we don't become the people that just stand by on the sidelines and watch terrible things unfold in the media?
I think it's very important to think first and to question common wisdom. I think we have to, I think the best thing that the university can teach students is to question the realities around them, the images around them. So when they look at these images around here, when I'm talking, it's very important to think about what I'm saying or what you're saying, what are these images saying, and then find out the truth about them. And also, it's very important to understand that we live in a digital world that every person can be a medium, and every voice is important. When I was imprisoned, and I'm not a very spiritual person, and as I said, I was thinking about the practicalities, but I was feeling that I was being thought of by other people. Whenever my interrogator was asking me different questions, I could see that there is something going on in the outside world that's made him. And those were the Facebook petitions, those were the Twitter petitions, those were the campaigns that was staged by my colleagues at Newsweek and other places. So I think it's very important to use the social media and other media that's at our disposal, and Instagram can be used to look at the pictures of One Direction. But it also, I don't know if people like One Direction here. No? Yeah.
That's a British group, right?
No, but I think they're quite hot here. I thought, I don't know. At least they're saying that they are. I don't know. Anyways, yeah. I would say Spice Girls, but that shows my age. Yeah. And yeah, and or you can use it for a social cause or a political cause, and to that you have a voice, that you have a medium that you can use.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. We will now take some time for questions from the audience, and there will be a mic going around, so please raise your hand, identify yourself, and ask a question. So this gentleman in the back in the red shirt, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sam. I'm a first-year MA here. My question is, history goes in part to the victors, and it's unfortunately, looking like, and in Syria certainly, that the victor is going to be the Assad government. And so my question is, how do we memorialize, how do we pursue justice outside of the space where the atrocities occur? I think this also can go, apply to Iran as well, where the regime is still in power, and you have a whole community of people who are exiled. How do we do these things outside, and do they have the same impact, and how can we generate that impact from outside?
Well, the question of impact is open to interpretation, but I think whatever impact you can have, you should try to have that. And as I mentioned, we have different social media, we have the traditional media, we have campaigning. And also, I think because of all this, we can create these virtual memorials. And I think people have started to do that for Iran, definitely for Syria, for the Rohingya. And I don't think that I think this new phenomena, this new media, have created a situation that the history is not going to be rewritten by the victors anymore. And history is being studied by different people and being analyzed by different people from both the victim's point of view and the victor's point of view. And I think we can see that in many situations right now. I mean, Syria is one of them. The situation of the Rohingya is another one. And the question of impact is, I think we have to understand that these genocidal leaders, like Bashar al-Assad, or authoritarian leaders like Ayatollah Khamenei, they do not want to be pariahs on the world stage. They want to be as respected as Queen Elizabeth or, King of Spain. And they want to be celebrated when they come out of the country. And they want to be highly regarded. So when you criticize them on social media, in traditional media, or through campaigning, you are somehow making them more accountable. You are making their government accountable. And then in democracies, you have a vote. You can go to your representatives and ask them to raise their voices for those causes.
All right. Right here in the front, please.
Geert van Brandt, alumnus 74. At the very end, Mansour said, I really believe that there will be justice. I don't think many Nazis were imprisoned in Germany or in America where they fled, or in Argentina. I don't think many Rwandans were imprisoned. I don't think the bankers who caused the financial crisis were imprisoned. What makes him think that people who, the perpetrators, will be punished?
Well, I think to start with, let's distinguish the bankers who caused the financial crisis with the Nazis and Rwandan, Yeah, well, I'm sure that they are very different.
He always asks hard questions. I should know not to call on him.
Yes, yeah. I think, yes, justice in a sense that those Nazis, I'm not sure how many Nazis were executed or tried after the Second World War and the situation was, but we can say that in the past 70 years after the end of the Second World War, justice somehow has come to Germany, and through Nazis being Nazism, or the idea behind Nazism being somehow eliminated in Germany. I mean, the fact that you might be able to kill 1,000 Nazis or people who were working for the apartheid regime, but then you may create more hatred. And that is not really getting rid of Nazism. Like the situation in Iraq now, that many people who were working for the Ba'ath regime, they were executed. Many people who were working for the Ba'ath regime, they lost their jobs. But I don't think that the Iraqis are experiencing justice right now, because the idea behind what Saddam Hussein did, the idea behind the Ba'ath regimes is still there, and it's being carried out in different names by different groups in Iraq now.
So your response makes me think, though, that beyond kind of punishment of the perpetrators, there's also the issue of certain circumstances allowed and enabled the Nazis to do what they could do. And you could look at different countries in the world today and point out some of those circumstances and say, oh, that's something that, if it led down a certain path, X could happen, very similar to what happened to the Jews of Europe. In the United States, I think people are paying attention to certain kind of political behaviors and dynamics along the same lines. So, I mean, kind of what's your take on that, looking at the more systematic side of justice?
Well, I think Nazism, if you look at Nazism as the cause or the symptom, that's very different. Mm-hmm. Nazism in Germany did not descend from Mars, or didn't, Nazis did not invade Germany from France or Poland. Nazism grew in Germany, and after centuries of anti-Semitism that Hitler managed to mobilize the Nazis and in order to kill so many Jews in Germany and other countries through collaborators. So I think you have to look at the circumstances that how, and while we were, in the interview, I mentioned the book Tyranny that, talks about how authoritarian regimes come to power, how Nazis came to power, and how to defend democracies and institutions. But also, I think it's very important not to exaggerate the situation, that the United States right now is very different from Germany in 1933. So I think thinking that, yes, those idiots who were in Charlottesville can take over the White House and, they can assign Supreme Court justices is different.
Sure. All right, I think we had a couple more questions in the audience. Okay, this woman right here, please.
My name is Mayana. I'm from Syria, and I have family there. So when you talk about reconciliation, this is really a proxy war for many countries. I mean, we have Iran, Turkey, the United States, Russia. The Syrians don't believe, most of the people fighting in Syria are from other places. So I don't know how you can reconcile that.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, it's a proxy war. Part of it is proxy war, but there are many Syrians who are committing atrocities against other Syrians. And also those foreign forces, whether they are helping the Assad regime or they're helping ISIS or other groups, they are hosted by Syrians and they're welcomed by some Syrians. Of course, I think, and it's not scientific, I've never done a scientific survey in Syria, I think the majority of Syrians, like the majority of people around the world, they just want to go about their normal lives and they want to have peace and security. They don't want to be shot because of, just walking on the street. But I think this conflict is happening in Syria. And for a better future in Syria, people have to question how did ISIS manage to take over a large part of Syria? What were the circumstances that allowed that? How could the Assad regime be in power in Syria since 1968, 1969, and how could, they manage to commit suicide? How could they manage to disappear almost 100,000 people? So those are the questions that I think has to be answered by Syrians, and I think in many other countries as well. As an Iranian, we always talk about the British and the Russians and the Americans interfering in Iran in the past. And always thinking about what happened outside. Even the Arabs, we say that, all our problems come from Arabs invading Iran 1,400 years ago. Otherwise, we were a really peaceful Persian Empire and we were ruling the world. And, if we could have better neighbors, yes, yeah. But, that is just not thinking about our responsibilities and confronting the past. So I think, again, going back to the film and what Mansour wants to do, what the Holocaust Museum is doing, what other institutions in this country are doing, like the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta or the Lynching Museum in Alabama, those are very important because those atrocities happened in this country and people in this country had to confront it.
Your question brings up another important topic and challenge, which is how does the policy process and the issue of relationships between states shape kind of an outside process of reconciliation and justice between people. They can't happen completely independent of one another, but they definitely don't complement one another right now. So I think that's a lot of work to be done on that in the future. Let's take this question, and is there another one? We can take a couple at one. Okay, so this gentleman in the front.
Hi, my name is Alan Latour. I'm an alumnus from 73. My question may be a little off topic, perhaps. Not a lot, just a little. But I'd like to...
Not about financial crisis.
No.
You two are friends, I know, I can see it.
Yeah.
Or One Direction.
It's not often that I get to speak with, an Iranian filmmaker such as you. When the Ayatollah regime seized power, I think it was in 79 or 80, I shook my head and thought, surely this atrocious regime will last a year or two, maybe, before sinking under the weight of public opinion and before another revolution takes place. But to my amazement, 40 years later, the Ayatollah regime is still here. As an Iranian, how can you explain that to me?
In like 5 minutes.
Yeah, in 5 minutes. Well, I think the 1979 revolution in Iran was an ideological revolution. And like all ideological revolutions throughout history, it failed. And the ideology became a tool for people in power to remain in power and to exert power through that ideology. So what you see in Iran right now, 40 years after February 1979 Islamic Revolution, is not that government that came to power in 1979. It is a facade of that government, and it's become a corrupt, militarized, run-of-the-mill Middle Eastern dictatorship that's been in power. And it's and 40 years later, people know that it's a failed experiment. It's not being able to provide for its people. It has not been able to manage the economy well. It's been wasting Iranian resources. It's been wasting, it's had a disastrous international relationship, international foreign policy. And as you see right now, the Iranian government, if it was not for the stupidity of some of the countries that oppose Iran and are critical of Iran, would be alone in the world stage right now. But Iranian government has been very lucky that there is no cohesive alternative within Iran. And also people have come to a collective realization that a revolution is not the real answer for change in Iran. They had one revolution in 1979, and they don't want to have another violent revolution anymore. So they are looking for peaceful evolution or reforms in the country. And as a result, I think you were right to say that this government would change, and it has changed, but it's become something much worse.
Any final questions from Mazair? Yes, please, absolutely.
My name is Gregory Kwolek. I'm a Polish student actually here from Warsaw, but I'm right now on the National Security Studies here. But back in Warsaw, I'm a journalist. I'm just curious, from my journalistic point of view, how important is journalism in the Middle East? And do you think there's it can be like a factor for change? I know it's not a free media environment, but there are journalists are people who can get the story and get it out to the outside world and also make opinion shift, right? So what do you think about it?
No, I think journalism is becoming very important in the Middle East, and as a result, journalists are becoming targets of different regimes. You can see more journalists being targeted, being killed in the Middle East and other parts of the world. You can see more citizen journalists even being imprisoned by different governments, whether they are friendly with the West or not friendly with the West, they are imprisoned and tortured. And I think journalism is actually one of the ways that these regimes can change, because these regimes, as we talked about the Iranian government and ideology, they are about control, and they are about controlling people resources of the country in order to survive. And what journalism can do is to show the problems with the system. The journalism can show the corruption in the system. Journalism can show different sides to different regimes. And as a result, I think journalists, courageous journalists and citizen journalists in the Middle East and around the world, they're doing an amazing job to change the world for the better. And I think, unfortunately, because of certain media outlets, the journalists, they've had a very bad reputation in this country, and and I think the fact that some people call journalists enemy of the state, it's been very counterproductive, because I think journalists, traditional journalists, and citizen journalists, they have a very important role to play, and many of them, most of them, playing that role. We do not see it, they're not always on CNN or MSNBC or whatever these days, but they're playing a very important role.
Any other questions? I have one last question for you.
Sure.
If you can tell us what's next for you, what are you working on? Is there anything you can share with us about your next project?
We have a bunch of projects going on at the same time. We have the Iran Wire project that's it's a daily news website that we have. It's in English and Persian. If you want any real information about Iran, you can visit iranwire.com. We have a couple of campaigns as well, and when I say we, I mean, I'm not talking about royal we, I'm talking about me with my colleagues back in London and all around the world and inside Iran and other countries. We have Journalism is Not a Crime, which is a campaign for journalists around the world, again, talking about the importance of journalism and the fact that what an important role journalists play and how dangerous journalism as a profession have become. And also we have another campaign called Education is Not a Crime, which is for the Baha'i. I'm not sure how many people know about the Baha'is. Baha'is are the biggest religious minority in Iran, but they don't have any rights as citizens of Iran. And I think for any real change, I'm not a Baha'i myself, but I think for any real change to happen in Iran, the situation of the Baha'is have to improve in the country. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We will
Well,
follow
thank
your
you.
future work with
Thank
great
you.
interest.
Thank
Please
you.
join me in thanking Mazair.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And also thank you to our friends from the Holocaust Museum for making this possible. And thank you to all of you for joining us on a rainy day. Have a good night.
Thank you.